The moment I opened the door and stepped into my house, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't a gut feeling or paranoia. It was the air itself, thick and still like the house was holding its breath. The lights were off, which wasn't unusual since I often got home late, but the faint scent of cologne that wasn't mine still lingered in the air. It was expensive, something sharp and musky, nothing like the cheap deodorant I sprayed on every morning. I set my bag down by the door and took a deep breath, listening. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling, but my instincts screamed at me that I wasn't alone. I walked further in, scanning the living room. Everything was in its place. TV remote on the coffee table, Emily's slippers near the couch, the half-empty wine glass she always left behind, but something still felt off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I turned towards the hallway leading to our bedroom. That's when I saw it. A belt. A black leather belt with a silver buckle lying just outside our bedroom door. And it wasn't mine. I stared at it, my mind scrambling for explanations. Maybe Emily bought it for me. No, I never wore belts like that. Maybe she found it somewhere. No, why the hell would a random belt just appear in our house? The silence felt deafening now, my heartbeat loud in my ears as I took a step forward. The wooden floor creaked beneath me, and for the first time in our 8 years together, I hesitated before opening the bedroom door. I pushed it open slowly, just enough to see inside. The dim glow from the streetlight outside cast shadows across the room, but even in the dark, I could see the outline of someone sitting on the edge of the bed. A man. He froze. I froze. Emily, standing near the closet in just her robe, turned towards me like a deer caught in headlights. "Steve, you're home early." I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't even breathe for a second. The room felt like it had shrunk around me, closing in until the only thing I could focus on was the stranger sitting on my bed. My bed. The man, mid-30s, tall, built like someone who never skipped a gym day, slowly stood up, his hands raised slightly as if I was some wild animal ready to pounce. "Look, man," I didn't let him finish. I lunged. My fist connected with his jaw before he could react, the impact sending him stumbling back against the dresser with a loud crash. Emily screamed my name, but I barely heard her. The only thing in my mind was the fact that this man, this stranger, had been in my bed, in my house, touching my wife. He raised his hands, either to block another hit or to show he wasn't fighting back, but I didn't care. I grabbed the collar of his half-unbuttoned shirt and slammed him into the wall, my knuckles aching from the force. "Who the hell are you?" My voice came out steady, but there was nothing calm about the way I was shaking with rage. The man looked at Emily, eyes pleading for her to step in, but she just stood there frozen, her mouth slightly open like she was struggling to find the right words. When she didn't answer, he exhaled sharply and turned back to me. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married." That single sentence sent another wave of anger crashing through me. I pulled back and hit him again, harder this time, my fist sinking into his gut. He grunted, doubling over, and I shoved him towards the door. "Get the hell out of my house." Emily finally moved, stepping in front of me with her hands up like she could stop what was happening. "Steve, stop. Just let him go." I stared at her, barely able to believe she had the nerve to ask me for anything right now. My chest heaved as I took in the way she looked, robe loosely tied, cheeks flushed, hair still slightly damp like she had just come out of the shower. My stomach twisted at the thought of what had been happening in this room before I walked in. The man straightened up, rubbing his jaw, and nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'll go." He took a step towards the door, but I wasn't done. I grabbed him by the back of his shirt and yanked him back, my voice low and sharp. "What's your name?" He swallowed, eyes flicking to Emily again, but when she stayed silent, he muttered, "Eric." I let out a humorless laugh and nodded slowly. "Eric. How long?" He hesitated, but I wasn't in the mood for games. I tightened my grip on his shirt and he winced. "I don't know, man. A couple of months." My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. A couple of months. Not a one-time mistake, not a moment of weakness. This was planned, repeated, something they both chose over and over again. My wife, had been sleeping with this man for months while coming home to me like nothing was wrong. Eric took my silence as permission to leave and quickly slipped past me, practically running out the door. I let him go. He wasn't the one I needed answers from. I turned back to Emily, who still hadn't moved. She wrapped her arms around herself, like she was suddenly aware of how exposed she was, but I didn't care. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, eyes darting around the room like she was searching for an excuse, something she could say to make this better. Say something, I demanded, voice rough. Emily licked her lips, took a shaky breath, and finally spoke. I never meant for you to find out like this. I let out a short, bitter laugh, running a hand through my hair. That's what you have to say? Not that you're sorry, not that it was a mistake, just that you didn't want to get caught. She winced, shaking her head. It's not like that, Steve. Then explain it to me, I shot back. Explain how it's not like that. Explain why you've been sneaking around behind my back with some guy for months. Explain how you could look me in the eye every damn day and lie to my face. Emily flinched, but she finally looked at me instead of the floor. It just happened, she said weakly. I felt another surge of anger. Bullshit. Nothing just happens for months. You made a choice. Over and over again. Her eyes filled with tears, but I wasn't about to let that make me feel guilty. Not now. Not after everything. I don't know what you want me to say, she whispered. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to steady myself, but it didn't help. Tell me why, I said, quieter this time. She bit her lip, glancing towards the door like she wanted to escape this conversation. I don't know, she admitted. Things between us, they haven't been the same. That was the moment I felt something crack inside me. I let out a breath and nodded. Right. So instead of talking to me, instead of telling me you weren't happy, you decided to screw some other guy behind my back. That makes sense. Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked ashamed. I didn't want to hurt you. I clenched my fists, trying to keep my voice from shaking. You didn't want to hurt me? Emily, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you even care? She wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. Of course I care. But what do you want me to do? I can't take it back. I stared at her, feeling something inside me harden. No, you can't. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. This was it. This was the moment everything changed. I had spent years believing we were a team, that no matter what, we would always have each other's backs. Now, I didn't know who I was standing in front of. Finally, I exhaled and shook my head. You made your choice, Emily. She took a step towards me, but I stepped back. Steve, please. No, my voice was firm. You don't get to beg now. Not after everything. She let out a choked sob, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. I turned towards the door, grabbing my keys off the dresser. I need to think, I muttered, already walking out. Emily's voice cracked as she called after me. Where are you going? I paused in the doorway, gripping the keys so tightly they bit into my palm. Anywhere but here. And then I left. I didn't drive anywhere specific, just kept my hands on the wheel and let the road stretch in front of me, my mind cycling through every single moment that had led to this. The more I thought about it, the worse it got, because suddenly everything made sense in a way that made me sick. The late nights, the sudden need for privacy, the way she had stopped reaching for me in bed, how her phone was always face down, how she always had some new reason to stay late at work. I had ignored it, dismissed every sign because I never thought she would do this, but I had been wrong. And now I was out here driving aimlessly because I couldn't stand to be in my own home. After an hour, I pulled into the parking lot of a small diner that was still open, the kind of place where people went to drink coffee in silence when they didn't want to be home. I walked inside, took a seat at the counter, and stared at the menu without reading it, my mind too tangled to focus on anything. The waitress, a woman who looked to be in her late 50s with tired eyes and a friendly smile, came over and poured me a cup of coffee without asking. You look like you need it, she said, and I nodded because I didn't trust myself to speak. I sat there for a long time, hands wrapped around the warm cup, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do now. Divorce seemed inevitable, but the thought of it felt surreal. One minute, I had a wife and a home, and the next, I was just a guy sitting in a diner in the middle of the night, drinking bad coffee and trying to make sense of how my life had fallen apart in a matter of hours. I reached for my phone before realizing I had no one to call. Telling my parents wasn't an option because they had always liked Emily and wouldn't know what to say. Calling a friend felt pointless because what could they even do? Tell me they were sorry? That didn't fix anything. The door to the diner opened, and for a second, I looked up out of instinct, expecting to see Emily standing there, but it was just some couple coming in, laughing about something. I turned away and stared back down at my coffee, willing myself not to think about her. An hour passed before I finally pulled myself together enough to leave. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, and for a moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to decide if I even wanted to go inside. But where else was I supposed to go? This was still my house, even if it didn't feel like it anymore. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, and stood in the hallway, listening. The bedroom door was closed, and the silence was heavy. I walked past it without slowing down, heading straight for the couch. I didn't bother getting a blanket or a pillow, just sat down and let my head fall back against the cushions, staring at the ceiling. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of movement in the kitchen. My body ached from sleeping in the awkward position, but I didn't move, just listened as Emily opened cabinets and set something down on the counter. A part of me thought about just walking out without saying a word, but I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of making me avoid my own home. I stood up, stretched out the stiffness in my back, and walked into the kitchen. Emily was standing by the stove, making coffee like it was just another morning, like nothing had happened. The sight of her moving around so casually sent a fresh wave of anger through me, but I kept my voice steady. "You slept well." She froze for half a second before turning around. Her eyes were red-rimmed like she had been crying, but I didn't care. She had no right to stand there looking broken when she was the one who had done this. "I didn't really sleep," she admitted. "Must be nice," I muttered, walking past her to get a glass of water. She took a deep breath and leaned against the counter. "Steve, we need to talk." I set the glass down a little too hard and turned to face her. "Oh, now you want to talk? Funny how that works." She flinched, but she didn't back down. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand that it wasn't about you." That made me laugh, a sharp, humorless sound. "Oh, so it just happened, right? You woke up one day and accidentally landed in someone else's bed." She winced, but kept her gaze steady. "I was unhappy, Steve." I shook my head, exhaling through my nose. "And instead of talking to me, you decided to find someone else to fix it?" She swallowed hard, but she had nothing to say to that, probably because she knew I was right. I ran a hand down my face, suddenly too exhausted to keep doing this. "Are you in love with him?" Her breath caught, and she looked away, hesitating just long enough to make my stomach twist. "That's all I needed to know," I said, turning to leave the kitchen. Emily grabbed my arm, her grip desperate. "Steve, please. I don't want to lose you." I pulled away, my voice calm despite the way I felt like I was barely holding myself together. "You already did." She let out a choked sob, but I didn't stop. I walked back into the living room, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I didn't slam the door when I left, even though I wanted to. I just pulled it shut behind me and stood on the porch for a second, breathing in the cold morning air, trying to decide where to go. I didn't have a plan, didn't even grab my wallet. But there was no way in hell I was staying in that house with her standing there acting like she suddenly wanted to fix things when it was too damn late. I got into my car and started driving, turning down random streets until I ended up parked outside a small bar a few blocks away. It was too early for a drink, but I didn't care. I needed to be anywhere but home, and a quiet bar with no expectations seemed like the best place to disappear for a while. The bartender gave me a look when I walked in, the kind that said he wasn't used to people showing up at this hour unless they had a real good reason. He was an older guy, the type who had probably seen every kind of broken man walk through his doors over the years. I sat at the bar, rubbing my hands together, and when he finally walked over, he didn't even ask what I wanted before pouring me a whiskey and setting it down in front of me. I stared at the glass for a moment before finally speaking. "Do I look that bad?" The bartender leaned on the counter, crossing his arms. "I've been doing this a long time. You've got the look of a man who either lost his job or his woman. Judging by the ring still on your finger, I'm guessing the second one." I picked up the glass and took a slow sip, the burn in my throat doing nothing to numb the anger still boiling inside me. "Yeah, something like that." The bartender didn't push, just nodded and went back to wiping down the counter, letting me sit there in silence. I appreciated that. The last thing I needed was advice from a stranger telling me things would get better when, right now, it sure as hell didn't feel like they would. I sat there for a while, staring at my drink, thinking about all the ways I had been blind. Every single moment in the past few months that should have made me question things. All the nights she had come home late. All the times she had turned her phone over when she got a message. I had let myself believe everything was fine because the alternative was too painful to consider. But now, there was no avoiding it. The woman I trusted more than anyone had been lying to me for months, and I had been too damn stupid to see it. I didn't even hear my phone vibrating at first. When I finally pulled it out of my pocket, I saw Emily's name flashing on the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to answer, but I already knew what she was going to say. Apologies. Excuses. Promises that meant nothing. I let the call go to voicemail and shoved my phone back into my pocket. The bartender came back over, raising an eyebrow. Wife. I nodded, taking another sip. He let out a low whistle and shook his head. You want another one? I should have said no. I should have gotten up and walked out, but instead, I just nodded, and he poured me another without a word. By the time I left the bar, the sun had moved higher in the sky, but the heaviness in my chest hadn't gone anywhere. I got back into my car, sitting there with my hands gripping the wheel, trying to figure out my next move. Going home wasn't an option. I wasn't ready to see her, to hear whatever pathetic excuse she had lined up. But I couldn't just sit in this parking lot forever either. I ended up at my brother's house. David was the only person I could think of who wouldn't ask too many questions, at least not right away. He was younger than me by 3 years, married with 2 kids, and had a way of reading people without them having to say much. When I knocked on his door, he took one look at me and stepped aside without a word, letting me in. We sat in his living room, the sound of cartoons playing in the background as his kids ran around in the next room. He didn't ask why I was there, just handed me a beer and waited. I took a long sip before finally speaking. Emily cheated on me. David let out a slow breath and leaned back on the couch, rubbing a hand over his face. Damn, that's all you got? I muttered. He shrugged. What do you want me to say? That I'm shocked? That I didn't see it coming? He shook his head. I don't know, man. I always thought something fell off lately, but I didn't want to be the guy who put doubt in your head if there wasn't anything going on. I stared at him, feeling another punch to the gut. So you knew? I didn't know, he said quickly. I just noticed things. The way she acted when we were all together, the way she looked at her phone a little too much, the way you seemed to be the only one holding on. He sighed. I hate to say it, but I'm not surprised. I clenched my jaw, taking another drink. Great. So I was the only idiot who didn't see it. David shook his head. That's not what I meant. Look, man, when you love someone, you don't go looking for signs they're screwing you over. You trust them. That's not stupidity. That's just what decent people do. I ran a hand through my hair, exhaling sharply. Well, I'm done being decent. David studied me for a moment before nodding. So what are you going to do? I took another sip of beer, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue before answering. I don't know yet, but I know I'm not going to let her talk her way out of this. David gave a small nod, setting his bottle down on the table. Good, because she doesn't deserve that. I sat there in silence, letting his words sink in. I had spent years thinking that no matter what, Emily and I would always work through things together. But that wasn't the case anymore. She had made her choice. Now it was my turn. I didn't go home that night. I stayed at David's, barely slept, just lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, running everything through my head over and over again, trying to figure out how I had let it get this far without seeing it. Emily had tried calling me again, but I ignored every call, letting them go to voicemail. At some point, she stopped trying, and that silence felt heavier than the phone ringing. Around 6 in the morning, I finally sat up, rubbing my face, exhausted but too restless to close my eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. David walked into the living room, still half asleep, scratching the back of his head as he looked at me. You look like hell, he muttered, grabbing a water bottle from the fridge and tossing it to me. I caught it and twisted off the cap, taking a long drink before setting it on the coffee table. Yeah, well, I don't feel great either. He sat down across from me, letting out a slow breath. So what's the plan? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. I'm going back home, I said finally, the words sitting heavy in my mouth. Not because I want to fix anything. I just need to deal with this, figure out what happens next. David studied me for a second before nodding. Yeah, you do. But listen, don't let her twist this into something it's not. You know how people like her are. They cheat, they lie, and then when they get caught, they suddenly have all these reasons why it's not really their fault. I nodded slowly, already knowing that was exactly what she was going to do. Emily had always been good with words, good at making people see things from her side. I had let myself get pulled into that for years, had convinced myself that every argument ended with me seeing things the way she wanted me to. But not this time. This wasn't some misunderstanding, some minor issue we could talk through. She had spent months lying to my face, going behind my back, sharing a bed with another man while pretending to be my wife. There was no talking through that. I left David's place without breakfast, still feeling like my stomach was full of something heavy and sour. The drive home felt longer than usual, like my car was dragging its wheels through mud, like something in me knew I didn't want to step back inside that house and face whatever version of Emily I was going to find. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the house like it wasn't even mine anymore. When I finally pushed open the front door, Emily was already sitting in the living room, waiting for me. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her face pale, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled into a messy bun like she had spent the whole night thinking about what to say. I walked past her without a word, straight to the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, acting like I wasn't even going to acknowledge her until she spoke first. "Steve," she said quietly, standing in the doorway. I didn't look at her, just took a sip of coffee, waiting. "I know you don't want to hear what I have to say, but you have to let me explain." I set the cup down, finally turning to face her. "Explain what? That you cheated? That you spent months lying to me? I already know that, Emily." She swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around herself like she was trying to keep herself together. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head. "And how exactly was it supposed to happen? Were you planning to leave me? Keep sneaking around until I figured it out on my own? Or were you just hoping I'd never find out at all?" Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she was going to say something defensive, but instead, she just sighed. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was confused, okay? Things between us, they weren't the same anymore." I stepped closer, staring at her. "You keep saying that like it justifies what you did. If you weren't happy, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me you wanted something different instead of screwing some guy behind my back?" Her eyes welled up with tears, but I wasn't going to let that get to me. I had spent years caring about her feelings, about making sure she was okay, about trying to be the husband she needed me to be. But none of that had mattered when she made the choice to betray me. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. I exhaled sharply, looking away, because if I kept looking at her, I was going to say something I couldn't take back. "Well, you did. And now you have to live with that." She reached for my arm, her fingers barely brushing my skin before I pulled away. "Steve, please. We can get through this. We can fix it." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time since this all started, I felt nothing but exhaustion. "No, Emily. You broke this. And I'm not interested in fixing something that doesn't mean anything anymore." Her face crumpled, and she let out a shaky breath. "So that's it." I nodded, stepping back, putting distance between us. "That's it." The silence stretched between us, heavier than before, and I could see the realization settling in her expression, that this wasn't something she could talk her way out of, that I wasn't going to be the man who forgave and forgot. I wasn't going to make this easy for her, because she sure as hell hadn't made it easy for me. Finally, she nodded, wiping at her face. "I'll pack my things." I didn't respond. I just turned, picked up my coffee, and walked out of the room. Emily didn't pack her things right away. She lingered in the house like she was waiting for me to change my mind, dragging it out as if leaving would make everything final in a way she wasn't ready to accept. But I had already accepted it. Every time I walked through the house, I felt like I was moving through a place that no longer belonged to me. Like every piece of furniture, every framed photo, every little thing we had built together was nothing more than a reminder of how much of a fool I had been. I stopped talking to her unless absolutely necessary, didn't answer her when she tried to start conversations, didn't acknowledge the way her eyes followed me like she was searching for some sign of weakness, some moment where I might crack and give her the opening she needed. 2 days after I told her it was over, she finally packed. I came home from work and found suitcases by the front door, her keys on the counter next to them. She was in the living room, sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. When she heard me walk in, she stood up and took a slow breath, like she was bracing herself. "I found an apartment," she said, voice quiet. I nodded, not asking where. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated, eyes searching my face like she was looking for some sign that I might soften, But I didn't. I know I can't take back what I did, and I know I hurt you. I was selfish. I should have been honest with you instead of everything else. I stayed silent, because what was there to say? I had no interest in giving her closure, no interest in letting her feel better about herself just because she had finally admitted what she did was wrong. She wasn't apologizing because she truly regretted it. She was apologizing because she had lost. She swallowed hard and looked away. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted you to know that I did love you. I let out a slow breath, shaking my head. No, you didn't. Her eyes snapped back to mine, and for the first time, I saw something other than guilt. A flash of frustration, like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to convince me that what she had done somehow didn't erase everything else. You don't get to say that, she said, her voice sharper now. Just because I made a mistake doesn't mean what we had wasn't real. I pushed off the wall, stepping closer, my voice calm but firm. A mistake is something you do once and regret immediately. What you did wasn't a mistake, Emily. It was a choice you made over and over again. And you don't get to stand here and tell me you loved me while you were doing it. She flinched, her hands curling into fists at her sides. You act like this is easy for me. Like I don't feel awful. Like I didn't spend the last few days thinking about everything I destroyed. I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, you feel bad? That must be tough. But you don't get sympathy from me, because the only reason you feel bad is because you got caught. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I shook my head and stepped back. Just go. For a second, I thought she was going to argue again, but then she exhaled, her shoulders sagging like she had finally realized there was nothing left to say. Without another word, she walked past me, grabbed her bags, and opened the door. She hesitated on the threshold, looking back at me one last time, but I didn't move, didn't speak. And then she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her, and just like that, the house was quiet. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, waiting for some kind of feeling to hit me, relief, sadness, anger, something. But all I felt was empty. I walked through the house, room by room, looking at everything she had left behind. A coffee mug in the sink, a sweater draped over the back of a chair, a drawer half open in the bathroom where she used to keep her things. I stared at them for a long time before I finally started moving, grabbing a trash bag from under the sink and methodically going through every space she had occupied, throwing out everything she had left behind. It took me less than an hour to erase her from the house. I sat down on the couch, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of everything settle on me. I had spent years thinking this was the person I was going to grow old with, that no matter what, we would always find a way back to each other. But none of that had been real, not in the way I thought it was. And maybe I should have been angry, maybe I should have been devastated, but all I felt was done. I didn't want her back. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to waste another second of my life thinking about her. I wanted to move forward. And that's exactly what I was going to do.